Thank you for joining us for Sunaparanta's ListenIn program, and this is episode 15. I'd like to thank all of our guests for making the time to be with us here today. I know it's very early, so good morning to you all on the West Coast. And I'm really glad that you said yes to this and we can delve into the world of video games with you. We began in September at Sunaparanta with looking at non-traditional ways to engage with art, and that started with street art. Today, we're going to look at video games and the intersection of art, design, and technology within. Games have been around for centuries, and board games were unearthed from Tutankhamun's tomb, even. And in the last 40 years, we've moved into the digital world of gaming. An industry report estimates that approximately 3.1 billion people in the world play video games. That's about 40% of the world's population. Video games are perhaps a natural evolution of what we've always done, which is play to discover new worlds, discover each other, build communities, and discover ourselves. To delve into this fantastic medium, we have with us today leaders in the field of gaming, and I'm really glad to introduce them. I am going to introduce them very briefly though, because if I spent all my time doing that, we'd be out of time entirely. Tracy Fullerton is an experimental game designer, professor, and founding director emeritus of the USC Games program and director of the USC Games Innovation Lab. She has to her credit Emmy nominations and several different awards. Jenova Chen is a video game designer who founded That Game Company in 2006, where he remains the creative director of That Game Company. He's designed games that have been nominated for several awards, including an Emmy, won the Apple Design Award, and his game Journey has been lauded as one of the best games of all time. Dhruv Jani is a founder of a game studio called Studio Oleomingus, based in India, where they work at the intersection of post-colonial writing and interactive fiction. His games have been part of several exhibits all over the world, including at the V&A Museum in London. Tanya X is the captain of Kitfox Games, an independent game studio in Montreal. She's widely known as one of the most important women in gaming, and she is also the co-founder and co-director of Pixels, a non-profit helping more kinds of people make games. She does believe that everyone should try their hand and make a game once, so that's a great transition into our session today. Thank you all for being here again, and thank you for making this happen. I wanted to start out, maybe Tracy, with you, and we could talk about the importance of video games and why are games important, not just economically, but as a cultural force?
So, I think that the question actually shows us how far removed we see games from other types of media, right? The fact that you have to ask me that question, but you're not asking me that question about film or literature or art, shows how we see games as a very different form of expression than these kind of more normalized types of artworks, right? So to me, one of the things that's very important to me is that we strive to disintegrate that divide between the various media. And I don't personally, having grown up with games, see an incredible difference between games as an expressive media or film or literature or music or television. Any of these formats are about expressing ideas and creating experiences. So for me, I don't see a large gap, right? And in fact, if we were to look at games, we were to look at all these other forms of media, games predate many of these other forms of media in culture. Humans were playing games, right, before they were ever making films or, creating conceptual art, right? Humans were playing games when civilizations were just beginning, right? As you mentioned, early games have been found in burial sites, and we can track back some of the kind of classic board games that we play even today to early versions, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. So for me, the fact that we have to make this argument is disappointing, to say the least, as a person who works as an artist in games.
Can I ask one of you to come in here? Because I know, Jenova, you have this idea that you would like when people meet each other, that, they ask each other, what games do you play? So I wanted to talk about how they've become a central part of a lot of, 40% of the world is playing them. That number is only going to go up. So how do you think they're playing a role in our lives today and in society?
I think we human beings consume, media for many different reasons. We learn things. We sometimes just need emotional supplements. We're human beings of all emotions. We're capable of all, and sometimes we crave certain emotions. And I'm very sure at this very moment of time, more people in this world is craving for certain feelings than other. And so when we're missing the emotion, what do? We go, find some activity that would make us feel better. And so that could be listening to music, that could be watching a movie, that could be playing a game. Just not everybody has the habit of playing games to get emotion in video games. I think, like basketball is a game, right? It's not a video game, but a lot of people love to watch that. What kind of emotion does it give you, right? And people go to see the Coliseum, right? Like that was a huge entertainment, right? And today it's replaced by football or, other type of giant stadium, entertainment. And actually those type of emotion would never be replaced by, reading a book, and certain type of emotions is way better using a certain type of medium. And I think games, different from movie and from music, is good at interactions. And so there are certain emotions that is interaction that is more effective at communicating. Like the feeling of accomplishment and the feeling of frustration, right? And that is way easier if you're interacting.
Yeah, I think as a designer, what's most exciting to me about games becoming more accepted widely as art is seeing people really get into the dialogue between the creator and the audience. So like I'm trained as a writer originally. My undergraduate was in creative writing it was in English literature. But the interaction between author and reader is why it has been discussed for thousands of years, and it exists in paintings and it exists in theater and exists in lots of other forms. But in video games, it's so present and in your face and complex and rich emotionally that as a designer, there's nothing like it, that you can really, really have a conversation with the player and have them talk to you and share a world with you in a way that passive media doesn't really let you. And I mean, you could say a lot of these things you could do in theater. And in a lot of ways, I think theater is the closest art form to games because of some of the possibilities in that space. And I would say some plays that people have put on have actually been games, I would say. But as a designer, I get very, very excited about seeing people wanting to have new kinds of conversations with players and wanting to share new sides of themselves, because that's the real cutting edge of video games to me.
Yeah, I mean, when Tanya says that video games are very, very close to theater, I completely agree. I think video games are in a position to inherit at least a very specific kind of theater practice, that was quite prevalent around Southeast Asia, folk theater or street theater, which is insular, like video games are insular, irreverent, like video games are irreverent, and often challenge, they're sort of designed to challenge conventions or imperial or colonial hegemonies. And video games are ideally suited to do that, while recording, say, vernacular narratives, local stories, personal and intimate ideas and tales, and all of this, not only because both are performed in real time, both of them are to a certain extent enactments, but also because video games require from the reader, the player, a kind of labor you have to engage with game systems for them to make meaning, and that engagement, the longer it lasts, whether the game is narrative or not, results in narrative and meaningful interaction getting created, especially across longer and longer periods of time, and with greater and greater amounts of labor. And that is where we think they sort of differ from other analog or linear mediums.
That transitions so beautifully into what I want to get into next, is the idea of how video games are kind of an amalgamation of different kinds of art forms. And they allow for storytelling in a way that probably no other medium does, especially when, say, we look at traditional forms of visual art. You look at a painting or you look at a sculpture, and you, at least I, maybe not you, I look at it and I often wonder, what is that world like? What is that world of the artist who's creating this? What are they thinking? What do they want you to feel? What do they want you to see? What do they want you to hear? And when it comes to video games, you do that. And all of you have built amazing games that have done this. And I'm actually going to play a clip from one of Dhruv's games first, actually, so we can take a look at that one. And this one's called Under a Porcelain Sun. So that's a very short clip from this game. And Dhruv, I thought maybe you touched on this idea of reinterpreting history and kind of making peace with different narratives. How do you see your game doing that? Because that's something your studio focuses on quite a bit. And what role does gaming play? How does it enable that?
As we mentioned just a little while ago, games require a certain amount of participation on the part of the audience, and we call it redacting authorship. You deliberately lose control over the narrative of the game to make room for other interpretations. And as you mentioned, games tend to carry a tremendous amount of context and sort of layered information with them when they're presented, allowing players to interrogate ideas and histories and stories that are embedded inside games. And when we looked at that structure, which is rather porous and intricate, we realized that games are ideally suited to tell a certain kind of story, a certain kind of post-colonial fissured narrative, which can capture and retain multiple meanings, often contradictory meanings, and multiple histories and multiple lived realities at the same time. And we started to examine if video games could then become sites of discourse, for these kinds of stories, which is what Under a Porcelain Sun or many of our other games have tried to do.
Tracy, when you, at the Games Innovation Lab, when you think of what can be a game and what can't be a game, how do you approach that kind of thing in a academic setting? Because for a lot of academics, I think it's that works as a way to simulate the real world. Sometimes you're able to take more chances when you're at school for something. How do you kind of go about that idea of what works as a game and what doesn't? Because when I see the breadth of what all of you have created, it's almost anything that, if you see something, it could be turned into something beautiful and interactive.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and this is one of the reasons that I was a game designer in the industry, and I moved first part-time and then full-time into academia, and built a research lab there. That question, actually, we pose it a different way. Well, we're not interested in putting boxes around what games could be and what they aren't. We're interested, to be honest, in sort of making the boundaries of what we think of as games more permeable, and exploring areas that are half games, or taking elements of games and pulling them out, saying, what is a game without an objective? Or what is a game without boundaries, right? Or what happens when we move the boundaries out, right? What happens when players are no longer in competition? What happens when they are, trying to do something in the game that also affects the real world? There's all these different ways you can construct questions, and to me, those are research questions, right? That's the kind of thing that we try to do at the lab. And one of the issues with academia is that we're often often like ahead of the curve, right? That's part of the project of academia and research, is that we are doing things that are not marketable right now, right? But every once in a while, you hit on an idea that's so strong that it actually does become a real world experience, and I would point to something like Jenova's games, which kind of were, those questions were being asked at a particular moment in time, and just so happens that right when they were being asked and right when Jenova was graduating, certain technologies were coming online. The PlayStation was bringing on PSN, and there was just this convergence of people asking questions about what are games, can they be something more than they are, what do games mean to us? And here's this new kind of technology where we could distribute games. And so it's a funny thing for academics, because often we are trying to overshoot. We're trying to, do things that are way ahead, but every once in a while, and this is where the impact comes in, some of the ideas that are generated in academia sort of find a landing spot and become very influential. And that's the dream of academia, is to do both, right?
Jenova, do you want to come in there a little bit and talk about it's a very funny story, actually, because I invited both of you to be part of this panel quite independently, and then it's fun. It's nice to see that here's someone who developed a game in an academic setting, and then now you're both probably inhabiting the same world. So to see something that started out in academia and then become, of course, wildly successful, but also one of very meaningful. That's incredible. You don't see that happen too often, so it's great to see that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me being here. Like, I'm rarely being on the same panel with Tracy and talking about something that is not about us. So it's actually quite nice to see, how everything I've learned from Tracy in school, is, actually comes true, and it's just happened to be the right time. We took some of the school project out to the commercial field, and it's equally accepted. And looking back, it seems almost instant, but even in the actual acting of carrying it out, it still is a gradual process. So I remember back in 2009 when we made this game called Flower, on the PlayStation. Yeah, and when it first came out, people were very mad at our game. They say, this is not a game, and how could you charge us for money on stuff like this? You know, where are the scores? Where is the enemy? You know, where is the boss? This game is not complete. And our Metacritic score was 70 something, 75, 78 when it came out in 2009. And then I think 2 or 3 years later, after Sony relaunched PlayStation 4, they have to do a remaster of the PlayStation 3 games. Now the single line of code has been changed. It's the same game being re-released on PlayStation 4. And the review gave us, same Metacritic gives us 89, right? The same game, not change a single line of code, was, you know, more than 10 scores higher just in 2 years. And people suddenly had the taste buds to say, oh, this is actually the indie game, you know, the artsy games, you know, like, but 2 years ago, they were like, this is not a game. And so it's a slow process, even for us when we released our game. Yeah, and it's kind of amazing to see how far a game has come. And I remember when we were negotiating with Sony to get a deal, we were talking to a lot of publishers. And I remember that time when we were talking to Steam, and we are trying to make our cloud game, and we're trying to get funding from Steam. And Steam said, you know, our audience only play games where a gun is featured. So we like your game, but that's not for our audience. So, you know, and looking at Steam now being the home for all like indie games, it's, yeah, heaven and earth has been moved ever since.
Tanya, could you maybe come into this, because I think you're a force to reckon with in that world, and building the whole idea of everyone being able to develop their own game, because the need for more diverse voices, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tracy hit it exactly, that there's a convergence of many factors that has helped the kinds and diversity of game developers increase, but there's also many factors still holding it back artificially. And I think the availability of technology, you know, it's easy to complain about Unity as someone who works in Unity every day. It definitely isn't a perfect tool. But the fact that it's available for free and has been for so long, and it's been so open and allowing people to share their knowledge with each other, and all these kinds of, there's many decisions that Unity made that absolutely changed the face of game development. And many more people now, if they believe they can sit down and figure out how to make a game in an afternoon. It is possible. Like, you can look up YouTube videos, you can step through tutorials, and in 4 hours you can go from I've never done anything with games to I have a working prototype. And that was not possible 15 years ago. It just wasn't. And now it's eminently possible. It's highly recommended, in fact. And now the main thing that's holding people back is this belief that they can, or this belief that they should, or the belief of what a game is and what its purpose is. I think if more people thought of it in the same way as, you know, in high school you write a poem to see how it feels, and you make a little short film, and maybe you even make one as a gift for your girlfriend, or you make one for Mother's Day or something like that. Like that sort of homemade craft absolutely 100% applies to games, but we don't see it that way for various reasons. Because it's a commercial product primarily in culture, because it's seen as technological, which is highly male coded and gate kept, and there's all sorts of reasons culturally. But I'm here to tell you that I think everyone from like grandmothers to, you know, little tiny boys, you know, everybody in between should try making a game. And I saw someone spoke up in the chat saying they'd already made a game. That's awesome. Part of the reason why we started Pixels was because this is in 2013. You know, I've been a game developer now for a long time, and I could see that although there were more game developers of different types sort of coming up through the ranks, it was still primarily people like me who were gamers. And like, I've always been a gamer. Like, I've always, like, I had a Nintendo as a little girl, and I was always very, you know, yay, video games. but it shouldn't just be people like that who are making games. It shouldn't. It's ridiculous. It's like only, I don't know, PhDs should be able to use watercolor or something. And so part of what I would love to impress on everybody is just that, you know, games are messy and wonderful and emotional, and nobody should see them as some sort of impossible thing to make. They are difficult as an art form. There's a lot of things that make it hard, but it shouldn't be in your mind, in my opinion. Sorry, Tracy, I didn't mean to.
No, I want to build on what you're saying. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I really want to build and underline what you're saying. And I'm older than you. And when we started out, trying to make experimental games, the only engines available, and I won't name names, but when you open them up to mod them, because there really wasn't anything like a Unity, there was a gun. The first thing you saw was hands and a gun. It actually took a very long time to get the gun out. Mm-hmm. You had to work very hard to suppress the code for the gun. And I find this interesting because one of the things that we, forget is that we had to overcome ourselves in order to get to where we are. Right. So in the earliest days, like when Jenova was back at USC, we made our own engine without a gun, right? So that we could start fresh. And when engines like Unity came around, it was a revelation, because one of the choices that Unity made was to open it up to just a sort of Cartesian space, nothing there, right? And that blank slate that they chose to present was a break with the tradition of game making, right? And I just want to call that out, because I think what you're saying is really, really important. And also the choices made by the tool makers are really, really important about what we define as making a game. Jenova mentioned the early days of Steam saying, oh, all our games have guns in them, right? And this somewhat just archaic notion that a game has a gun in it holds us back, right? And it isn't until we divorce ourselves and that our blank slate becomes truly blank that we can really make games that are important cultural objects, in my opinion.
Sorry, Dhruv, if you want to.
This is sort of fascinating, because I'm sort of listening to a conversation about games and game making tools becoming more democratic during a period that we were clearly not making games or thinking about games, and a tradition that we then inherit, the work that everybody else did to open up game engines and make them more accessible is probably the only reason that we are making games now. I started making games a couple of years ago, and I still find that games are an incredibly privileged medium. That are not, and game tools as well. They are extremely Eurocentric. They're often written in English, in didactic language. They are powered by a massive industry of people assembling circuit boards and creating software in sort of sweatshop environments. Without games having the necessary voice to reckon with that, fundamental paradox that seems to power the bulk of the industry and make its democratic structure possible.
I want to touch more on this idea of, because there is a notion that games are all about predator and prey, they're about war, they're about violence, they're about these things, because maybe those are the games that are more widely covered maybe in mainstream media. I'm not really sure why that is, but that would be a question maybe not for us. However, I do think that all of you build games which are quite the opposite of that. So Tanya, you've built Moon Hunters, where you essentially have to build your own mythology and go on quests and build your own world. Actually, we can watch maybe a short clip of that so everyone can get a flavor of what I'm saying, and then we can delve into that idea. That's a very, very short clip of a game that essentially, Tanya, maybe you want to take us through, because when I read about it and when I look at it, it kind of seems like, you know, the world John Lennon was talking about when he said, imagine all of these different things. And that's essentially what this is. You get to not only create yourself, but it's your own mythology, which so much of at least life in India is influenced by.
Well, it sounds very grand. It came out in 2014, and it was sort of our first I don't know, bigger game as a studio. What it sort of ended up focusing on was like how will you be remembered as a hero? Like if you live your life and you're remembered, you know, as an exaggeration of yourself, will you be remembered as very charismatic or very vengeful or very deceitful or some combination of that? And I've always been really interested in how legends sort of grow around people and sort of become amalgamations of what they did, but also how people misunderstood what they did, and then how they fit into archetypes and all that kind of thing of the greater patterns that humans like to see when we look at other humans. But the core of the game is actually sort of just a simple RPG, really. Like there's a few little mini innovations in the conversation because it's a cooperative game. You can play with up to 3 other people. And so you like vote on how you answer your existential questions and what actions you take and things like that. But it was interesting to see that even just a very small change on sort of a typical RPG really did resonate with people. That people were like, oh, well, yeah, I'm fighting monsters, and yeah, I'm adventuring around this pixel world. But the fact that it pays any attention at all to how other people feel about you, how they remember you, what kind of influence you have on the people around you. It just shows a hunger that people want different kinds of games, that they want, you know, bolder, more interesting visions of worlds that aren't, you know, so shallow. And so that was part of what made me so like more brave and like, okay, if people are connecting with this, maybe I can go a little bit further. And that's sort of where Boyfriend Dungeon came from, was looking a little bit more like, okay, I'm still not willing to go completely out into academia, like crazy town. But you know, Boyfriend Dungeon is me thinking, okay, how do I make an even bigger twist on something familiar, but maybe that will fulfill what people wish was already there.
Jenova, can you come into this conversation? Because I think it's very interesting that in your games, initially, well, with the first few, there was no way to speak to another, you know, there was no text and there was no multiplayer. How does that kind of evolve into what you then created, where people could communicate with each other within the game, but only through sound? Or, you know, you couldn't chat as you would in even the most simple games otherwise that people play. And what was the thinking behind that kind of sense of creating a collaborative community?
Yeah, I would say that, well, first answer the very first question, because I've been thinking about the whole time I've been in this industry, is why are some of the earliest games made all have conflict and violence, right? And it is actually just a thing of convenience. You know, if you really think about it, to let a computer to simulate the world, what is the simplest thing to simulate? Physics is the most simple thing. You have a ball run into another ball and they bounce, right? And if you really think about all the major commercial video game ever invented, you know, at gunplays, you know, I mean, the first game's a simulation of real world, right? It's racing cars or playing ping pong or trying to shoot a gun and arrow. And it is really low computation, really. If you think about physics, it's actually the cheapest thing to simulate. Modern days, we talk about how, you know, the latest Zelda game has chemical simulations for the first time. You know, And after 30 years, people think about, oh, we should simulate that the fire can spread over the grass, can create wind. The complexity is only very limited and pixelated. Really, if you think about low pixel images, and then you think about simulation of the world. The simulation of Minecraft is like a pixelated version of a very simplified version of the real world. So yeah, and then because of the limitation, most of the games are happy just simulating physics. And if you think about physics, the first thing you can think about is breaking something down, knocking something off. And if you think about how physics works in life and culture is, remove something and kill something is the first thing you can think about. I guess it's like the direction of the universe is entropy, right? Like things are much easier to breaking apart than putting back together. Yeah, I mean, a lot of time we talk about, oh, it would be really, really nice if we could simulate a person who would talk to you intelligently, just like a real human being. What kind of game would that be, right? And I think we're today at a point where that is possible to imagine and it's achievable. But for a very long time, it's actually more work to try to simulate something more complex. The act of maybe killing an animal with a bullet is a lot easier to simulate than trying to raise an animal from, a little puppy and growing up and having relationships and all these things. So I think there is something about this, just the convenience and while we're trying to simulate it. The second part is also what does the audience want? When games first came out, the early adopters for new technology tend to be the younger one, the teens, the kids. They have no boundaries. You can't believe I was watching Jason Rohrer, the creator of Passage, right? And between he and his son was playing our game while we were still developing it. And we were trying to make a game on a phone, right? And so I put both phone to Jason and his son. I was expecting them to play together because that's what we hope to see a family playing. And Jason, as the father, have learned so much about games. So he has certain expectation. He said, hey, why isn't your game designed this way? Why do I do this thing to make myself move, right? Like he has all kinds of criticisms while his son's already flying. And it's just like amazing to see how quick younger people can adapt, right? I myself would be very dizzy every time I use VR, but I see kids just kind of living it, So what happened when game first was invented is these young kids who love the games and they want more of games that they enjoy. And at the core, what a kid wants in terms of emotional and entertainment is very, very far from what adult wants. And the kids have these cravings for much more primal and direct emotional response. Like if you think about the children's TV program, right? They have vibrant colors, usually the humor is body humor, right? And because kids don't understand the nuance, right? They only understand black and white. So what happened is you created this interesting market. They want certain type of games. And the developers, the industry, the review of the games, it creates a cycle, right? Like, okay, if majority of kids who play games are male, and then they end up writing about the games they play, and they end up influencing, the developer, like, oh, what kind of game they want to see more. And as a result, I think fine art and art in general is unfortunately a much older demographic. And so for a long time, the average age of gamer has been like, 20 something. And they prefer horror over thriller. They prefer, action over drama, right? They prefer comedy over art house, like when it comes to preference and emotional tastes. I remember when we made Journey, a lot of gamer in my age was like, oh, I can really understand what you're trying to say. But when presenting to a teenager, they would say, this is the most boring game ever. You just walk. There's no action. There's no enemy. That's tend to be, it's like the emotional range of what people want and what, whether it's art or it's entertainment, it is very separate. So because gamer has been very young, like action and violence has been, much more popular. But now the nice thing is every gamer who grew up are in their, 50s, 40s, and they have kids now, right? And they don't play game as often as they were, but this is the age where they are questioning the meaning of life. They're, thinking about things that's much deeper, and that kind of creates the space where the indie and artsy games are now having an audience.
I wanted to show a clip of actually Tracy's game Walden to talk about, what games could mean for change and what kind of things they can enable.
What if we could all go to the woods to live deliberately? Good day, Henry. Play as Henry David Thoreau in Walden, a game.
I wanted to get into this, how you thought about building a game like Walden. How did that come about? Because it's something that you read in high school, you read in college, you kind of go on to it. But how do you, all of you actually, look at something and decide this should be an interactive game experience? And how does that translate with design? How do you actually make a game?
Well, I'm going to start with the first one because the last question is so broad. I think we'd have to stay here for hours. But in terms of Walden, it was a very personal project, and I was inspired to make this game based on this classic book of philosophy. So just because I don't know if everyone is actually forced to read Walden worldwide, Walden is a book. It's a non-narrative. So it's not a dramatic book. It's basically a travel log of a guy doing an experiment and living simply in nature, Henry David Thoreau, over the course of 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days in Massachusetts. So it's a very famous book of philosophy. and nature writing, and early sort of themes of environmentalism and activism and social critique are coming out through this experiment that he's doing. And so, you know, for many people, they're like, what if you were going to make a game, you're going to make it on like Lord of the Rings, right? Why would you make it on this quiet little discussion of living, you know, philosophical discussion of living in nature? But to me, it was actually the perfect you know, subject matter for a game, because it was about questioning assumptions. It was essentially about setting up a set of rules to live in a location, and then within those rules Thoreau was allowing himself to question how one might live and why one was living, right? And so to me, that really was excellent fodder for a game. And so that's why we made it. And the way we made it was we started designing on paper. So we went through the book and we were looking for these questions and looking for what I call the rules of his experiment. And we built paper prototypes. And then when we came up with what we thought was a good simulation of his experiment, we started building digital prototypes in 2D and et cetera, et cetera. And interestingly, just kind of circling back to our early conversation, when we started building this game in 2007, I think that I might have seen a beta or something of Unity at that time, but it really wasn't ready. And it wasn't till about halfway through, so a number of years later, I think we switched over to Unity finally in like 2012 or something like that. But we were making it in the old engine. It was ridiculous. And the whole game had to be on Rails, and it was just a terrible thing. And Unity in the middle became such a open, interesting tool set for indies that we were able to then turn this into a 6-hour-long open world game with a tiny team, right? So one of the ways you make games is for me anyways, you set a personal goal. What do you want players to experience? What inspires you in life? What are the questions you're asking about how to live and why we're here? And turn those into games, turn those into a set of constraints and rules that people can play with and come up with their own answers. And then be responsive to the technological world around you. But don't let the technological world around you drive your design, right? It should be the other way around, trying to get a set of ideas across and experiences across. And then, you know, the technology comes around and you can use it to support your expression.
Whoever wants to chime in with that, and how do you look at something? Because a lot of people read books, a lot of people look at rolling fields, a lot of people look at different kinds of weapons and look at the things that are our problems in our society, but not everyone turns them into games. So I wanted to get into your artistic side and see, how did you do that? Because I know this is true for all of you.
So we work almost entirely with text, in most of our games, and most of our games are examinations of processes of historiography and how text is recorded and how histories and stories are told. And very early in the process, even though the games often refer to and talk about texts and that exist in the world outside games, we made the decision to invent an author whose works we will be adapting, in the form of Nirumar Hassan, and then write the space between analog texts and our video games, that we can then adapt from, to try and arrive at a point where we are not appropriating other voices into a more interactive format, but we are making game players complicit in the telling of the story. For example, if you were to read a book like Kim, you do not feel complicit in the interpretations of the character just because you are turning pages, but that is not true in video games. You become responsible to a certain degree for how the story unfolds, and we try and use that artificial sense of responsibility to engender conversations with specific points in history that are very uncomfortable to talk about.
Yeah, the advice that I usually give for new creators getting into game development through Pixels, for example, is actually, I think, advice that a lot of art people give, which is to focus on the emotion that you want the player to feel. whether you want them to feel excited about something or dreading a certain something or whatever it is that you're trying to evoke. I think if you focus on that and work backwards to how do I make that emotion happen, you're going to come out with a better, more interesting game than if you, which is very common for gamers. Gamers tend to think, oh, okay, I'm going to make it like this game, only whatever. And that's much less fruitful, I think. And so our process tends to be that on a Google sheet somewhere, I'll write out like what are the key experiences that I want the player to have, and then work backwards about, okay, so we're going to do that through this system and this feature and that system, and then those might change, but the core, the target feeling, the target player experience won't change. That will be consistent till the end of the game, hopefully, till the end, till when we're finally releasing it. And I think that that's pretty consistent for most interesting, successful creators that I know.
We are quite close to the end. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then maybe we'll have a little bit of time for ones from the audience, though you have, most of you have answered a few of those while we've been going. I want to get into this idea of enabling change. And, can games change the lives of people who engage with them? And I know you've had stories of people who've played your games who tell you about the way they've been impacted by doing that. So maybe if you could share those with us and talk about the positive aspects, how gaming can affect people in a positive sense.
Sure. I'm always happy to share the stories, because sometimes as a developer, you thought you are making a game about one thing, but its impact on the player is completely, the other. So when we released Journey, we have a lot of people who write email to tell us how the game has influenced them. I mean, initially you just thought, oh yeah, people really liked the game. They were emotionally affected, and they cried for the game. That's what you usually expect, right? And what happened is a lot of people. There's one person who wrote to me. He said, I had fall into a frozen lake when I was a teenager, and by the time the ambulance came and they rescued me, they told me that I was clinically dead for more than 2 minutes, and they brought me back. And for the rest of my life, many of my friends ask me, what was it like when you are in the lake and during that 2 minutes? What is death like? And he said, I've looked all kinds of literatures, I've watched a lot of movies, and I recommend people certain scenes. And after I played your game, I can say out of all media, all combination, the very end of your game feels the closest to what I see when I was dead. And I recommend this game to people who are curious what it's like. And I was like, wow, I've never been in that situation. How could I know, right? That is a reaction that was quite interesting. I mean, I can theorize why he would feel that way, but it's something that I never expected. And then there were about 15 people who write email to us, tell me the same story, that I was pretty shocked, and I didn't realize there's a pattern here. So they are people who have lost someone very close to them in the family. There was one player who lost his grandma, who he was personally very close with. And so a developer who lost his dad, his dad called him at 3 a.m. and he just said, hey dad, it's 3 a.m. just call me tomorrow. Hand the phone. Next morning, his dad is had a heart attack in the midnight. So he died that night. And the son feel very, very guilty that he felt like he was part of the reason his dad died. So over the next 3 years, he could not come out of the grief. So are many of these players. They could not come out of the grief. But then by playing the game, and they run into a stranger online, right? They don't know who they are because it's anonymous in Journey. And even though they know this is another player online, but by playing through the game together with this stranger, they felt, especially when it goes through that emotional roller coaster, when they all eventually transcend, they felt that was the one they lost, that calm, using the hand of a person they've never met to say that it's okay, I'll be okay, and then they just cry. They feel like they were able to come off the grief. And I didn't make a game to relieve people's grief, right? But that emotion was somehow very therapeutic to these players.
That's a big part of when we look at artists, right, and what they create.
Mm-hmm.
That artists create art, and how that impacts people is kind of on them.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen it with a few people who've been part of our ListenIn program, where they say, I did this performance art piece because of X reason, but the audience saw it as Y. That in itself shows you the artistic side of gaming. I guess I'll hand this over to whoever wants to go next.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll just chime in. Jenova, I always love your stories, even when they make me really sad. One of the things that we've found, so we've been giving Walden away for free since the beginning of COVID to, we always give it away free to educators, but we've given it away free to parents who are homeschooling, and just we've been giving away like literally tens of thousands of copies to people who are teaching at home, and people and kids who are, trapped at home during COVID. And we have gotten like the most beautiful letters from teachers and from parents about using this game with their kids while their kids are trapped inside. And it's, this virtual experience living in the woods. And it's also about simplicity and sort of breaking one's life down into, the meaningful tasks, right? And I think in a way that we never expected, because in a way, I was making this game to sort of counteract modern society where it's all moving so fast and we all have our technologies and everything. And in a way, what's happened with COVID is there's become a real resonance with the sort of simplicity of life during kind of lockdown, right? And we've gotten these letters and videos that kids have made about their day in their Walden, and essays, which it's just beautiful. It breaks my heart about the way that they are understanding Thoreau's questions about what's important about our lives on a daily basis, and how the pace of our lives and the values that we have in how we do things alone and together are so important. So it's interesting. You make a game, you think, because I'm making a discussion about technology and the need to slow our lives down, and then suddenly we all slow our lives down. So it's just sort of been fascinating.
Game spaces, because they are so deliberately insular and removed from material need and a certain kind of idea of territory and possession, and because overwhelming authority is looking at it right now, they can become sites of protest and dissent, in very powerful, persuasive ways, and allow people to talk about ideas that are otherwise very difficult to talk about in other spaces or in other mediums. It is a role that has been passed down across mediums for a very long time, especially in countries that have fought, colonial rule or imperial rule of a certain kind. But I think video games can be a very interesting site for a kind of pirated history of our time, if you will.
Okay, I will switch over to a few questions from the audience. Just very quickly, someone wants to know if they are a non-gamer, and what should they read in terms of books and literature for game developers who are from different disciplines. Anyone?
For game design, I don't know if you all agree, but I thought the Book of Lenses, I've recommended to a few people, is an interesting way to look at game design from a few different angles. it's called A Book of Lenses, but it's about game design rather than game, the art form. It's more the craft of game design.
The method that Tanya was talking about, where you set an experience goal and design to that goal, we call that play-centric design. I have a book that I've written that is used at many game schools across the world, and is designed. The book is designed so it doesn't have to be taught. It's very much about just, if you've never designed a game before, if you've never thought about how to design a game, it's written in a way that you very simply, if you do the exercises in the book, you will build several games while reading the book. It's called Game Design Workshop, a play-centric method for innovative games. And yeah, so it's in its 4th edition. So some of the early editions are probably way cheap.
Next we have, in your experience, does your audience respond more to a realistic illustrative experience or an animated one?
But realism in a game is it's a mixed bag. Games can be very convincing simulations of the world around you, and then sort of moment to moment play. Realism occasionally adds a degree of engagement. But I've never found games that are driven almost entirely by a pursuit of realism to be all that, and only that, to be all that persuasive, either in the stories that they tell or kind of experiences that they create. Realism in and of itself, I don't think is a coherent goal to start building games with.
So the next one, which seems to be a fairly common theme, is what does somebody need to do to work at any of your studios / get into your games program?
Well, getting into the games program is an easy one to answer, so I'll just answer that. You can apply to the games program at USC. We have several programs for varying levels. So we have programs at the bachelor's, the undergraduate level, one in interactive media and games, which would be for folks interested in design and production, one in computer science games for folks who are more interested in development. We have 2 at the master's level. We have an MFA in interactive media and games, and we have a Master's of Science in computer science games. There's also, for those way at the end of the cycle, we have a PhD in media arts and practice. All of these programs work together, and specifically at each level, all of the students in all of the programs, it's a kind of meta program called USC Games, work together on projects. So they're in classes together, they're working together on projects, even though they're studying their various specialities. Yeah, you can find out more about the application process at games.usc.edu.
Yeah, for getting hired at an indie studio, I think it's really difficult because we tend to keep our team so small. Like, on Dhruv's studio page, it says there are 2 people. So probably getting hired there is going to be a tough job. And we're not that different. Like we're 8 people, but it's still, we only hire 1 person every few years. So compared to something like Ubisoft or Electronic Arts, it's going to be very, very difficult. I do think that there are some middle-sized indies, which I don't know if that's the case for that game company, if you're maybe a bit larger, so you hire a bit more often. But it can be very difficult, and usually my advice is to either consider joining a slightly bigger company that you're maybe immediately comfortable with, or maybe try your own thing and try to find your own way with you and some other people that you feel align with your values, that want to make the same kinds of things that you do. Maybe you'll find something beautiful together if you can afford to do that. I personally started in big AAA games, and I remember at the time I was so frustrated because I was like, I don't want to make games about shooting, this is 2008, we should be over this. I was so ready for Flower when it came out. But a lot of the world wasn't, and AAA still isn't in a lot of ways. So, but I went and, I did that to be able to afford to go indie some years later. And I think that's still a valid path. Don't feel like you you have to follow your heart or you're not a real game artist. I think you can build your skills in a few different ways. So even if you do end up working on Assassin's Creed, you're still a good game developer. I still believe in you and your vision. Do what you need to do.
So yeah, I would say there is a very key difference, because a lot of people asking in the writing as well, is that there is a difference between you want to get into games because you want to be the author of a game versus, hey, I love games, I wish I could be in the industry, I would take whatever job is possible, right? It's a very different situation. It's like going to the movie or into, let's say, the orchestra, wanting to be the director and the conductor, versus like, oh, it's just so cool to be playing music with a bunch of people. I would just want to pick up whatever instruments, right? That's two complete different intention of getting into the game industry. So the first one, let's say, if you want to be an author, if you have something to say, and you want to say it through the video games, the quickest path is not to go to work for a big company, because those companies want to personalize, focus on individual roles to optimize the production, right? So you will be pigeonholed into just being the best sound designer, the best concept artist, the best game design, right? But you wouldn't be put on a role of, hey, go figure out a game for us to make, right? And so the best way to practice or to get into the author role is to write. It's kind of, I'm not saying like you have to write novels, but it's like, if you want to be a director for a film, you start shooting film at home by yourself with your buddies. That's how you become better at telling stories. You don't go to a giant movie factory and say, hey, can I be a golfer? I would just be holding the microphone. You don't become better as directing, right? But I've run into a lot of people who don't necessarily want to be the director. They just loved these games. They want to be part of it, right? And it's like, just like the orchestra, right? There's so many different instruments. You don't necessarily need to know which instrument is yours. You can go just sitting in an orchestra, just kind of listen and see, oh, I really like that guy playing the cello. I think cello is the coolest thing, right? And then I could learn about cello. It's much smaller and focused, right? And maybe one day when you play cello so well, you were like, this conductor sucks. Maybe I should just be the conductor, right? Some people do grow into a director from a particular role, and game is so wide in terms of disciplines. It's the widest, I call it the buffet of all pre-existing media, right? You can make a game with no sound, right? That's fine. You can make a game with no visual. That's fine, right? And so for me, I think if you're here, if you're curious about art and, like you listen to our conversation, you're probably interested to become an author, right? And like what Tanya was saying, that the technology has freed us so that everybody can actually be an author. If you just put in maybe a couple of months of study, you can make a game very quickly, right? This is the period in the film history is when the Super 8mm camera was invented, where everybody can make some homebrew videos, right? So right now we have these kids going to the summer program, like in less than a month, they're making a game, right? So it is basically at the point where the tool is free and the level of skills you need to make a game is low enough that if you're interested in say something through games, the quickest path is just try to do it. And in the process of making one game, you will learn so much things, because that learning is the most efficient when you have a purpose and you have a problem to solve, and then you learn. I've seen a lot of kids go into the gaming program because they don't know what else they want to do in life. So they were like, I like playing games, so I go to a video game program, but they have nothing they want to say. They didn't really want to be an author in the land of video game. And they just kind of, go through the years and without being better. But if you are here and if you want to be an author, you'll learn so much so fast. So yeah, it's just like, I remember a lot of people I met in the industry would ask me, hey, how did you get into become a director for a game? I've always been thinking about doing that, and but I just thought I need more experience. So I'm gonna work at this AAA company for a few years longer so that I will be prepared. I said, man, like the people I know who are directors, they just start doing it and then they become better, and don't wait, so.
Thank you for making the time to be here. And on that note of just going out and doing what you actually want to do, we will end today's session. Thank you very much.